They saw him every morning. Always in the same spot, across the street from the cafe, slumped on the cold bench, wrapped in layers of torn jackets, motionless like a statue carved from defeat. Most people didn't even glance his way. Those who did, curled their lips in disgust, or made jokes under their breath. To them, he was just another bum. He never begged, never asked for food or money, just sat there with his head down, hands tucked into his sleeves, as if trying to disappear into himself. The cafe owner, a plump man named Rick, often muttered to the staff, "One day I'll call the city to haul that pile of trash away. He scares off customers." And some customers agreed. Businessmen in tailored suits, college kids with expensive phones, they all threw side glances. Occasionally, someone shouted, "Get a job, old man," or tossed a crumpled napkin at his feet. The man never responded, never looked up, as if he had learned that silence was safer than hope. But then there was Emily. She was new, barely 22, waitress. Not from the city, small town heart in a big city mess. While the others rolled their eyes, or cracked jokes, Emily noticed the old man. Noticed the way his hands trembled when he lifted a tin can to drink water. The way his eyes scanned the street like he was looking for something that no longer existed. So one cold morning, while Rick was busy yelling at the cook, Emily walked out the back door with a paper cup of coffee and half a sandwich wrapped in foil. She crossed the street slowly, nervous, like approaching a wounded animal. "Hi," she said softly, setting the items beside him. "Thought you might want something warm." The man flinched, his head rose just slightly. His face was weathered, beard thick with dust, eyes dim but alert, like coals buried under ash. He said nothing, just stared. Then slowly, he took the coffee in both hands, holding it like it was a rare treasure. No smile, no words, but a tiny nod. She did it again the next day, and the next. By the end of the week, the kitchen crew had a nickname for her, Mother Teresa. They laughed when she wasn't around. One of the baristas, Danny, said, "Maybe she's into old dudes. Needs a sugar grandpa." Rick wasn't amused either. He warned her once, then twice. Told her that feeding vagrants only made them stay longer. That this wasn't a soup kitchen. Emily nodded, but kept doing it. Quietly. Not for praise. Just because it felt right. The old man never told her his name. He never said much at all. But sometimes, as she crossed the street, he would already be watching, waiting. She began to notice little things. How his eyes followed passing sirens with fear. How he flinched at loud noises. How he slept with one hand clutched around a dog tag hanging from his neck. Sometimes he mumbled to himself. Words no one could fully hear. She once caught a phrase. "Alpha team down." Requesting exfil. Then silence. Who was he? At night, Emily would think about that question as she lay in her tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling. Who was this man before the streets took him? What had broken him? Meanwhile, the rest of the world kept walking past him. One life in the shadows of the city. One invisible man, seen by one girl. And for now, that was enough. It was late. The last customers had already left, and the rain had begun to tap against the windows like cold fingers. Inside the cafe, the floor was slick with mop water, and the kitchen buzzed with the sounds of dishes being stacked and ovens cooling down. Emily lingered by the counter, staring out the glass. Across the street, the old man sat beneath the awning of the pharmacy, soaked to the bone, arms wrapped around himself, shivering. He hadn't eaten all day. She knew that. Rick had been extra watchful, barking orders, watching her like a hawk. But tonight, Rick had left early. Emily stood alone behind the register. Her heart pulled hard. She walked into the kitchen and quietly packed a hot bowl of soup into a container. Added a roll. Then without a word, she pulled a clean old blanket from the emergency box under the sink, meant for staff during winter outages. She wrapped it all into a bag, took a breath, and stepped outside. The rain hit her like cold needles. She ran across the street and crouched down beside the old man. He looked at her with tired, wet eyes. She didn't explain, just placed the bag beside him and said gently, "This is for you, try to stay warm tonight." The old man didn't smile, but he looked at her longer than usual. Then slowly, he reached out, took the blanket, and pressed it to his chest like something sacred. Neither of them knew that one of the cafe's new security cameras had caught everything. The next morning, Emily came to work like always. She had barely tied her apron when Rick appeared in front of her, red-faced and storming. He held a phone in one hand, the screen showing paused footage, a grainy image of her kneeling in the rain beside the homeless man. "Explain this," he snapped. Emily stood frozen, then calmly, she said, "I gave him food, and a blanket. It was raining." Rick's jaw clenched. He hissed, "You just gave away company property. Blankets. Food. To that thing out there. You think this is a shelter?" She tried to speak, but he raised a hand. "You're done here. Go. I don't want thieves and bleeding hearts ruining my business." And just like that it was over. No official paperwork. No second chances. Her locker was emptied by the assistant manager, her apron taken. By the time she stepped out of the back door, it had started to drizzle again. Word spread fast. Customers who had seen her talking to the old man before now felt vindicated. A group of college kids laughed loudly as she passed. Finally, someone cleaned up the place. She was always acting like she ran a soup kitchen. An older woman in pearls nodded with satisfaction. "It's about time. That kind of filth doesn't belong here." Emily didn't cry. Not then. She just walked. Past the jeers. Past the looks. Into the growing rain. Across the street, the old man sat motionless on his bench. He saw her. She stopped in front of him for a moment, as if trying to say something with her eyes. But he didn't look up. He just stood slowly, wrapped the blanket tighter around himself, and walked away, hunched and silent, his steps swallowed by the rain. No words. No thanks. No justice. Just a girl who lost her job, and a man no one cared to understand. And still, the city buzzed on, too busy to notice two lives breaking in the same moment. It began like any ordinary morning. The same drizzle, the same gray clouds sagging low over the city. The cafe opened at 7 as always. Rick stood behind the counter sipping his burnt coffee, barking at the new girl to wipe down the windows properly. Customers filed in, umbrellas dripping, eyes fixed on their phones. Just another forgettable Tuesday. But at 7:24 a.m., something changed. The first siren was distant. Then came another. And another. Within minutes, the entire street was alive with flashing lights, and the deep hum of police engines. One by one, patrol cars pulled up and lined the curb in front of the cafe. Not one or two, but over a dozen vehicles, marked and unmarked. Uniformed officers stepped out, silent, composed, their boots splashing into the puddles. No one said a word. No one drew weapons. Yet the air thickened like before a storm. Inside the cafe, conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned to the windows. "What the hell is going on?" Rick muttered, pressing his face to the glass. "Police? Here." More cars arrived. Some officers carried flags. Others carried nothing at all. Across the street, beneath the pharmacy's awning, the old man sat in his usual place. Same coat, same blanket clutched in his lap, but his posture was different. Straighter. Still. As though he had known this day would come. And then, it happened. One of the officers, tall, broad-shouldered, a man in his late 40s, broke formation. He walked across the wet street, straight to the old man. He stopped just a few feet away. Slowly, he removed his cap and dropped to one knee. "Sir," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "we've been looking for you." The cafe fell dead silent. The old man didn't move. The officer bowed his head. "I'm sorry we didn't find you sooner." Then, as if by unspoken command, the rest of the officers followed. One by one, police from all divisions and ranks crossed the street. Some looked visibly shaken. Some held their hands behind their backs, in solemn respect. They formed two lines beside the bench, facing each other. A corridor of honor. One young officer whispered something, and another nodded. They adjusted their stance, heels clicking together. At the center, the old man finally looked up. His eyes met those of the kneeling officer. "You're James, aren't you?" he said quietly. The man nodded. "You were just a rookie when it happened." "Yes, sir. You saved my life." The old man didn't reply. He looked past James, at the other faces, the recognition in their eyes, the grief, the reverence. It all returned to him like a wave. Inside the cafe, Rick was frozen, pale, clutching the edge of the counter. "What? What is this?" he stammered. "What the hell is going on?" A customer pulled out their phone, already live streaming. "The old man," they said. "That's Commander Mason, Special Operations. Missing since Fallridge." Rick blinked. "No. That can't be. That guy's just some bum. He's been sleeping on cardboard for months." But more phones came out. People were already tweeting, posting, sharing. The man under the blanket wasn't just a homeless drifter. He was a decorated war hero. The legend who led the covert rescue of an embassy siege, who vanished after an operation went wrong. The man every officer here had read about in academy textbooks, presumed dead for over 15 years. Now here he was, sitting in the rain, alone, ignored, shamed by the city he once protected. And still, he had said nothing. A young officer stepped forward with something in her hands, a folded flag, pristine and pressed. She placed it gently on the bench beside him. The cafe door creaked open. Rick stepped out, trying to force a smile, his voice shaking. "Excuse me. I had no idea. If I'd known." But no one listened. Commander Mason stood slowly, with effort. James and two others supported him. He nodded once to the officers, then turned his gaze toward the cafe. There, behind the glass, stood Emily. She had come back, called by a friend who had seen the commotion, her eyes locked with the old man's. He gave the smallest nod. She understood. The city had turned its back on him, but she hadn't. By midday, the entire street was sealed off. Reporters began arriving from every local news outlet. Camera crews jostled for angles. People gathered behind police tape, whispering and pointing at the spot where only hours earlier, a man they had all ignored had sat unnoticed. At 12:30 p.m., a press conference was held in front of the cafe. The crowd parted as a high-ranking officer stepped forward, flanked by a public relations officer and two deputies. Microphones were raised. The city was watching both in person and online. "Thank you all for coming," the spokesperson began, voice steady but somber. "We understand this morning's events have raised many questions. It's time for answers." He took a breath, glancing at a paper in his hands, then looked directly at the cameras. "The man known to many of you simply as a homeless individual on 3rd and Main is in fact Commander Jonathan Cade, formerly of the elite Special Operations Unit known as Black Shadow." The murmur through the crowd was audible. Commander Cade led numerous classified missions abroad. In 2009, he was presumed dead during a failed extraction deep in hostile territory. His body was never recovered, and he was officially declared missing in action. A long pause followed. The weight of the words settled over the listeners. "We now know that Commander Cade survived. Badly injured, he was taken in by a small village, suffering from severe trauma and memory loss. It appears he made his way back to the United States on his own several years later, under no known identity." The crowd was silent now. Commander Cade has been living on the streets of this city for nearly a decade, unnoticed, unrecognized and untreated. He avoided shelters, never spoke of his past, and kept to himself. And then the spokesperson's tone shifted, quieter, more personal. Until recently, his memories began to return. Slowly, painfully. He still suffers from gaps in recall and disassociation, but one constant tethered him to reality. A single person who treated him with humanity. A young woman named Emily Harper, a waitress at this cafe. The cameras turned toward Emily, who stood off to the side, stunned, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every time she offered him coffee, every time she said good morning, she anchored him to a world he had lost, to a name, to a purpose. Her kindness was not charity, it was rescue. For the first time since the announcement began, Emily's eyes filled with tears. The officer continued. It is tragic that a man of such valor could walk among us invisible, and more tragic still, that the one person who extended compassion was punished for it. We are here today not only to honor Commander Cade, but to remind ourselves what honor truly means. Behind him, several officers lowered their heads. As the statement ended, reporters shouted questions. Why hadn't anyone noticed him before? Why didn't he speak up? What would happen to the cafe now? But the officers said no more. That afternoon, images of Jonathan Cade and Emily Harper spread across every screen in the country. The photo of the officer kneeling in front of the old man went viral. People shared it with captions like "a real hero." And sometimes the strongest are the most forgotten. In offices and classrooms, homes and coffee shops, conversations began. Who else have we overlooked? That night, Jonathan sat in a small private room provided by the precinct, clean and dry for the first time in years. He stared at the cup of tea on the table in front of him. Emily had made it. She knocked once, and entered quietly, holding a blanket, the same one she'd given him weeks ago from the kitchen. He looked at her, his gaze steady now, clearer than it had ever been. You knew, didn't you? He asked. Not who you were, she said softly. Just that you were someone. He nodded. The silence between them was warm, full. He took the blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Thank you, he said. You saved me too. Emily replied. The following days felt like a whirlwind. The moment the press conference aired, public outrage swept across the city, and then the country. News stations ran the story non-stop. Homeless man turns out to be decorated war hero. Headlines blared. Cafe fires waitress for feeding a legend. People were furious. The comment sections filled with fury and guilt. Everyone wanted to know how it had gone so unnoticed. How a man like Jonathan Cade could vanish in plain sight. The cafe, once a quiet corner for commuters and lunch breaks, now faced a storm it could never have predicted. Within 24 hours, its review pages were flooded. One-star ratings piled up, each one leaving scathing remarks. Shame on you. You fired the only decent human in that building. I'll never eat here again. Customers stopped coming. Protesters began appearing outside, holding signs that read, "Humanity first and heroes deserve more than leftovers." News vans parked across the street every morning. The owner, who had always strutted around with arrogance, now avoided the cameras, his face pale and drawn. No press statement could fix what had already shattered. Meanwhile, Emily Harper was receiving a very different kind of attention. She was invited to speak on a local morning show, sitting nervously in a borrowed dress, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked more lost than excited. The host smiled warmly, but Emily's voice cracked as she answered questions. She wasn't used to this. She never wanted fame. Why did you help him when no one else would? The host asked gently. Emily hesitated. Then softly, because he looked like someone who used to protect people. I didn't know who he was. I just felt like he mattered. Tears welled in her eyes, and the studio fell silent. That clip alone was shared millions of times within hours. Back at the police department, Jonathan sat with two senior officers and a federal liaison. The process was long. Paperwork, old files, debriefings. But in the end, the truth came together. His years of service, his injuries, his disappearance, it was all confirmed. He was owed compensation, not just for his service, but for a decade of being forgotten by the system. Jonathan didn't want money. He'd said as much. But as the forms were laid out before him, he paused. There's someone who kept me alive when I didn't remember how. He signed a portion of his benefits over to Emily. A life-changing amount. Enough to cover debts, education and more. She protested, of course. But when he handed her the envelope, he simply said, "This is not a gift. It's your share in what brought me back." And that was that. Weeks passed. The cafe closed down temporarily, then permanently. The building was quietly sold off. No one seemed to mourn it. In its place, months later, opened a new space, Harper's Corner, a community cafe run on a simple mission. No one leaves hungry. No one sits alone. It wasn't Emily's idea at first, it was Jonathan's. But she made it real. Jonathan Cade never returned to the streets. Instead, he returned to the world. As an honored guest at ceremonies, as a name spoken with respect, as a face remembered not just in files and medals, but in hearts. Schools invited him to speak. Veterans sought him out. Young officers listened when he talked. He walked with a cane, still slightly hunched, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. Every morning, he sat by the window of Harper's Corner, sipping coffee prepared by Emily herself. They didn't need to speak much. The silence between them held everything they'd endured. One day, a little boy walked up to Jonathan and asked, "Were you really a soldier?" Jonathan nodded. "Did you fight bad guys?" He smiled gently. "I tried to protect the good ones." And that was all the boy needed. Honor, it turned out, wasn't in the medals or uniforms. It was in the small acts. A warm cup of coffee, a quiet hello, a stranger who cared. Jonathan Cade had once been invisible. Now he was impossible to forget. 6 months later, the building that once housed the old cafe reopened, but this time, there was no neon sign flashing lunch specials, no cheap plastic chairs crammed along the windows. Instead, a new plaque hung by the door, simple, dignified. It read, "Jonathan Cade Veteran Support Center." The transformation was quiet but profound. Gone were the greasy menus and judgmental stares. Now, the rooms held shelves of donated clothes, offices where veterans could speak to counselors, classrooms for skills training, and tables where no one was ever turned away for lack of money. The air smelled of fresh coffee and purpose. At the heart of it all was Emily Harper. She never imagined herself leading anything. She'd been a waitress, someone who cleaned up after others. But now, she coordinated staff, planned outreach, met with donors, and shook hands with city officials. At first it overwhelmed her. Then she remembered the weight of that first cup of tea she'd ever handed to Jonathan. How her small act had meant something far bigger. She wore no title on her name tag. Just Emily. Jonathan, for his part, became a symbol, not the kind molded into statues or turned into military posters, but a living reminder that even legends could fall and rise again. One morning, a journalist sat across from him for a televised interview. The man had a notepad full of questions, but Jonathan barely looked at the cameras. "What saved you?" the reporter finally asked. Jonathan paused. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the warm ceramic cup to his lips. 1 cup of tea, he said, that's all it took. 1 cup, and someone who didn't walk past me. The clip went viral within hours. That phrase, 1 cup of tea, was soon printed on mugs, painted on the wall of the center, stitched onto tote bags used for food deliveries to homeless veterans. But no merchandise could capture what it truly meant, because the real story wasn't about tea, it was about being seen. Late one afternoon, long after the volunteers had gone home, and the sun dipped below the city's skyline, Jonathan sat outside the center. Beside him, Emily poured him another cup. No cameras. No applause. Just the two of them seated on a bench that faced the street he once called home. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Steam curled from the cups in their hands. The wind tugged gently at Jonathan's coat. A small child passed by with his father and waved. Jonathan smiled and tipped his head in return. His medals were locked in a drawer somewhere. His scars, both visible and not, remained, but he looked at peace now. Finally, the camera slowly pulled back. The city carried on. Lights flickered on. Cars passed by. But on that quiet bench sat a man the world had once abandoned, now restored. And beside him, the woman who chose kindness when no one else did. Black screen. A final sentence faded in, clean and still. Not all heroes wear uniforms, but they always carry dignity. Fade out.